There's a pattern that has systematically destroyed every major empire throughout human history, and it's not conquest by foreign armies, not invasion by hostile forces, not revolution from within, but economic collapse, specifically currency collapse that happens the exact same way every single time, without variation. Because Rome, which was the empire that ruled the known world for 5 consecutive centuries, collapsed when its currency became completely worthless, and Spain, which controlled more gold and silver than any nation in recorded history, went bankrupt repeatedly until its empire dissolved into irrelevance, and Britain, which dominated global trade for 200 years, lost its entire empire within a single decade after its currency collapsed. 4 times in recorded history, a dominant empire has followed this exact pattern with mathematical precision, starting with military overextension, followed by unsustainable spending, then currency debasement or money printing, which leads to inflation, then loss of confidence, and finally complete collapse. And every single time the people in power believed they were different, that their empire was special, that the old rules didn't apply to them, and they were wrong every single time without exception. And right now, in 2025, the United States is following that exact same pattern, step by step, warning sign by warning sign. So the only question is whether we're near the beginning, the middle, or the end. Let's start with Rome, which was the empire that dominated Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for over 500 years, because at its peak, Rome controlled 60 million people across 3 continents. Its military was unmatched by any rival. Its infrastructure was the most advanced on Earth, and its currency, called the denarius, was trusted everywhere from Britain to Egypt, and the denarius was a silver coin introduced in 211 BC that contained about 4.5 grams of pure silver. For centuries, this coin held its value because the Roman government maintained its purity. So, when you received a denarius, you knew exactly what you were getting: pure silver representing real value. And this created trust that allowed Rome to fund its expansion, pay its soldiers, and build its infrastructure across vast territories. But empires are expensive to maintain, and every generation Rome's borders expanded further, requiring more soldiers, more forts, more roads, more administration, and eventually more money than Rome actually had. So they did what every empire does when it spends more than it earns: they debased the currency. And Emperor Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 AD, was the first to significantly reduce the silver content of the denarius because he needed to fund his lavish lifestyle and expensive military campaigns. So he ordered the mints to reduce the silver content from 100% to 90%, which meant that extra 10% was pure profit for the emperor because he could mint 11 coins with the silver that used to make 10, creating more coins in circulation with the same amount of silver, which is inflation. But 90% silver was still substantial, and the real destruction came later because by the time Emperor Caracalla ruled in 211 AD, the denarius was down to 50% silver, half real value and half base metal. And by 265 AD, under Emperor Gallienus, it had fallen to just 5% silver. So, a coin that was once pure silver was now 95% worthless metal with a thin silver coating. And think about what that means for ordinary people. If you were a Roman soldier in 265 AD, receiving your pay in denarii, you were being paid in coins worth 1/20th of what soldiers earned 2 centuries earlier, and the government told you nothing had changed. The coins still said denarius, and they still had the emperor's face, but the purchasing power had collapsed completely. So prices exploded where what cost 1 denarius in 200 AD cost 50 denarii by 300 AD. Farmers stopped selling food for coins and demanded barter instead. Soldiers refused to fight unless paid in gold or goods. Tax collectors couldn't collect taxes because the currency was worthless, and the entire economic system seized up. And here's the key point to understand. This wasn't caused by foreign invasion, because Rome's borders were still defended. This wasn't caused by plague or natural disaster. This was self-inflicted where the Roman government destroyed its own currency to fund spending it couldn't afford. And when the currency died, the empire died with it, because by 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire officially collapsed, not because Germanic tribes were stronger militarily, but because Rome couldn't pay its armies anymore, couldn't fund its administration, couldn't maintain its infrastructure, and the currency had been debased into irrelevance. So everything built on that currency collapsed, proving the pattern of military expansion, unsustainable spending, currency debasement, inflation, loss of economic function, and collapse. Now, let's jump forward 1,200 years to Spain in the 1500s, when the Spanish Empire was just beginning its golden age. Because Christopher Columbus had opened the New World, Hernán Cortés had conquered the Aztecs, Francisco Pizarro had conquered the Incas, and Spain now controlled the richest territories on Earth, and in 1545, Spanish explorers discovered the Cerro Rico mountain in Potosí in what is now Bolivia. This wasn't just a silver mine. It was the largest silver deposit ever discovered in human history, and for the next century, Potosí would produce nearly half of the world's silver, millions of pounds of it, with ships loaded with silver crossing the Atlantic and filling Spanish coffers with wealth beyond imagination. And Spain minted this silver into coins, where the Spanish dollar became the first true global currency used from Europe to Asia, trusted and pure with an endless supply. Spain became the richest, most powerful empire on Earth. And at its peak, the Spanish Empire controlled territories on every inhabited continent where the sun never set on Spanish holdings. And then, exactly like Rome, they destroyed themselves. Because there's a paradox with money where more money doesn't make you richer if everyone has more money. So when Spain flooded Europe with silver, prices rose dramatically, where what cost one silver coin in 1500 cost 10 coins by 1600, the silver hadn't become less pure, there was just vastly more of it circulating, which is inflation, and Spain was importing so much silver that it was destroying the value of silver itself. And worse, Spain wasn't producing anything, because they weren't building industries, they weren't innovating. They were just extracting wealth from the colonies and spending it on wars, palaces, and luxury goods imported from other countries. The silver flowed in from the Americas and flowed right back out to France, England, and the Netherlands to pay for goods Spain didn't produce itself. And by the late 1500s, Spain's kings were drowning in debt because King Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598, inherited massive debt from his father Charles V, 36 million ducats in debt. And rather than cut spending, Philip borrowed more. He fought wars on multiple fronts against the Ottoman Empire, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, against England, and when the debt became unpayable, he defaulted. So, in 1557, Philip II declared bankruptcy and suspended all debt payments, which was the first sovereign default in modern history, but not the last, because Spain defaulted again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596, 4 defaults in 40 years. Despite controlling half the world's silver production, Spain couldn't pay its debts, and each default destroyed trust where lenders refused to lend to Spain. Interest rates on Spanish debts skyrocketed, and the government responded by debasing the currency, minting coins with less silver, and introducing copper coins that were supposed to be worth as much as silver coins. But nobody believed it, and the currency lost credibility. By the 1600s, Spain was in terminal decline where the military couldn't be funded, the colonies began to break away, and when the 30 Years' War ended in 1648, Spain signed the Peace of Westphalia, which marked the beginning of the end, and by 1700, the Spanish Empire was essentially over, proving the pattern again of massive wealth influx, government overspending, excessive borrowing, currency inflation, repeated defaults, loss of confidence, and collapse. Now we come to Britain, The empire that lasted longer stretched further and controlled more wealth than Rome or Spain combined, because at its peak in 1922, the British Empire governed 458 million people, 1/4 of the world's population and 1/4 of the world's land, and the sun never set on the British Empire not because they controlled every time zone, but because they controlled so much territory that it was always daytime somewhere under British rule. And the British pound sterling was the foundation of it all, because for over 2 centuries, the pound was the world's reserve currency where over 60% of global trade was invoiced in pounds, and the gold standard anchored everything where 1 pound sterling could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold, creating trust, stability, and power. But empires are built on credit, and credit has to be repaid. Britain funded its empire through borrowing government bonds, debt to finance wars, colonies, infrastructure, administration. And as long as the pound held its value, this worked. But then came World War I, and in 1914, Britain's national debt was £650 million. But by 1919, after 4 years of total war, it had exploded to over $7 billion, which was a tenfold increase in just 5 years. To fund the war, Britain had borrowed from everyone, from its own citizens, from the United States, from anyone who would lend, but the war also forced Britain off the gold standard, because in 1914, when war broke out, the government suspended gold convertibility, because they had to print money to fund the war effort, and they couldn't maintain gold backing while doing it. So the pound became a fiat currency backed by nothing but the government's promise. After the war, Britain tried to return to gold, and in 1925, Winston Churchill, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, put Britain back on the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate, which was a catastrophic mistake because the pound was overvalued. British exports became uncompetitive, unemployment soared, and the government had to maintain high interest rates to defend the currency which crushed economic growth. By 1931, Britain was forced off gold again permanently, and this time the pound was devalued and trust in British currency began to erode. But the real destruction came after World War II because Britain entered World War II already deeply in debt, and the war cost everything. So by 1945, Britain's national debt had reached 270% of GDP, where the empire had bankrupted itself to win the war. Entire cities were in ruins, the economy was shattered, and Britain owed massive debts to the United States. And in 1944, while the war was still raging, the Bretton Woods Conference redesigned the global financial system where the British pound was officially replaced as the world's primary reserve currency, and the US dollar took its place, and Britain fought desperately to preserve the pound's status. But it was over, because they had the debt, but not the gold, or the economy to back their currency anymore. What followed was a slow, humiliating decline, because in 1947, Britain tried to make the pound convertible again, but the experiment lasted 6 weeks before a run on the currency forced them to reimpose controls, and in 1949 the pound was devalued by 30%. Then in 1967, it was devalued again, and each devaluation destroyed savings, crushed confidence, and signaled to the world that Britain was no longer a first-rate power. Meanwhile, the empire disintegrated where India gained independence in 1947. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, and Britain's military response was a humiliating failure, and colony after colony broke away not because they were conquered by outside forces, but because Britain could no longer afford to maintain them, and by the 1970s, Britain was on the verge of becoming a failed state where inflation hit 25%. The government went begging to the IMF for a bailout, and the pound, which had once been the world's reserve currency, was now a symbol of decline, which brings us to now. The United States, the current empire, the current reserve currency, and every single warning sign that destroyed Rome, Spain, and Britain is flashing red. So let's start with the currency, because the U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency since 1944, and after World War II, the Bretton Woods system made the dollar the global standard backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Other nations pegged their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar was as good as gold, literally, but just like Rome and just like Britain, the United States started spending more than it had, funding the Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, military bases around the world, and by the 1960s, foreign governments noticed that America was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. France, under Charles de Gaulle, started demanding gold in exchange for dollars. Other nations followed. The gold was leaving Fort Knox and the bluff was being called. So in 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window where no more gold backing existed, and the dollar became a pure fiat currency, just like the debased Roman denarius, just like the pound after 1931, backed by nothing but trust and the government's promise. At first, it seemed fine because the petrodollar system established in the 1970s created artificial demand for dollars since oil was priced in dollars globally, but the spending never stopped and the debt kept growing, because in 1980, U.S. national debt was $900 billion. By 2000, it was $5.6 trillion. By 2020, it was $27 trillion. And today, in 2025, it's over $36 trillion, which is a 40-fold increase in 45 years, and it's accelerating. But the debt is only part of the story, because like Rome debasing the denarius and like Spain flooding the world with silver, the United States is printing money, and since 2008, the Federal Reserve has created trillions of dollars from nothing, through quantitative easing, which they call necessary to stabilize the economy. And during COVID, they printed over $4 trillion in 2 years, more money created than in the previous century combined. And just like every empire before they told us it wouldn't cause inflation, that modern economics had solved the old problems, that we were different, but we're not, because inflation hit 9% in 2022. And real inflation, meaning the prices you actually pay for food, housing, healthcare, is far higher, and the dollar is being debased slowly at first, but the pattern always accelerates. And just like Britain, the United States is losing reserve currency status because in 2000, over 70% of global reserves were held in dollars, but today it's 58% and falling. And the BRICS nations, which include Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and new members are actively building alternatives, trading in local currencies, creating new payment systems, reducing dollar dependence. China and Russia are buying gold aggressively. Central banks worldwide are diversifying out of dollars. And the world is preparing for the dollar to lose its dominance just like they prepared for the pound to fall. And the pattern is unmistakable. And here's the most dangerous part. The United States has the same problem Rome had, which is military overextension. The U.S. maintains nearly 800 military bases in over 70 countries. The defense budget is over $800 billion annually. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost over $8 trillion. And the empire is expensive, and it's being funded with debt and printed money. Just like Rome couldn't pay its legions in debased coins, just like Spain couldn't fund its military after repeated defaults, just like Britain couldn't maintain its empire after currency collapse, the United States is running out of time. So let's identify the pattern, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And every empire that has collapsed economically followed the same sequence, not similar but identical. Starting with Stage 1, which is dominance, where the empire is at its peak with military strength, economic power, and currency trust, like Rome with the denarius, Spain with the dollar, Britain with the pound, America with the dollar. At this stage, the currency is backed by something real like gold, silver, or trust built over generations, and the empire seems invincible. Then comes Stage 2, which is overextension, where the empire expands beyond its means, with more territory, more military commitments, more promises to citizens. Because Rome expanded across 3 continents, Spain tried to control every ocean, Britain colonized a quarter of the world, and America maintains bases on every continent, and the costs become unsustainable. Stage 3 is deficit spending, where the empire spends more than it earns. And at first, this is manageable because they borrow, they issue bonds, they promise to repay, but the deficits become structural and permanent because Rome needed to pay its legions, Spain needed to fund its wars, Britain needed to finance 2 world wars, and America runs trillion-dollar deficits annually, even during economic growth. Stage 4 is currency debasement, where the empire can't borrow enough and can't tax enough. So they debase the currency because Rome reduced silver in the denarius. Spain flooded the market with silver, causing inflation. Britain abandoned gold and devalued the pound twice, and America left gold in 1971 and has been printing ever since. Stage 5 is inflation, where more currency with the same amount of real goods means prices rise, because Rome saw prices increase 50-fold. Spain experienced price inflation across Europe. Britain saw 25% inflation in the 1970s. And America is experiencing inflation now, despite government claims it's transitory. Stage 6 is loss of confidence, where the domestic population and foreign nations lose trust in the currency because Roman soldiers demanded payment in gold, not denarii. Spanish creditors refused to lend after multiple defaults. The world shifted from pounds to dollars at Bretton Woods, and today nations are shifting away from the dollar. Stage 7 is collapse, where the economic system fails and the currency becomes worthless or loses its dominance, and the empire can't fund its military and can't maintain control because Rome fell to Germanic tribes it could no longer pay to fight. Spain declined into irrelevance. Britain lost its empire within decades. And the U.S., that's the question we're living through right now. That's the pattern. 7 stages repeated 4 times across 2,000 years, with different empires, different continents, different currencies, but the exact same sequence, because the math doesn't change where you cannot spend more than you earn forever. You cannot print prosperity, and you cannot debase your currency without consequences, and the pattern is absolute. And we're in stage 5 heading rapidly towards stage 6. So what happens next? Because history gives us 3 possible outcomes. First is controlled decline like Britain after 1945, where they lost the empire, lost reserve currency status, experienced painful devaluation and inflation, but the country didn't disappear, and it adjusted to being a second-tier power, in a slow, humiliating decline but not total collapse. Second is chaotic collapse like Rome in the 5th century, where the currency becomes worthless, the government loses control, the empire fragments, and dark ages follow, which is the worst-case scenario of complete systemic breakdown, not just economic but social and political. Third is reset and restructure, where a new currency system is established, maybe backed by gold again, or maybe a new reserve currency emerges like China's yuan, a basket of currencies or digital currencies. And the old system dies, but something new replaces it relatively quickly, which is painful but survivable. The United States is at the crossroads where the debt cannot be repaid, not at current levels and not with current spending. So the only options are default, inflation, or restructuring, because default would destroy dollar hegemony instantly. Inflation is already happening and will likely accelerate, and restructuring requires political will that doesn't currently exist. And here's what makes this different from Rome, Spain, or Britain, because those were regional empires, but the US dollar is the global reserve currency. So when the Roman denarius collapsed, it affected the Roman Empire. But when the dollar collapses, it affects the entire world with every central bank, every trade agreement, every financial market, because the interconnected global economy amplifies both the impact and the chaos. But the pattern says it's coming not because of prediction, but because of precedent. Because 4 empires experienced 4 currency collapses in 4 identical sequences, and the math of empire is unforgiving, where you can delay it and you can deny it, but you cannot avoid it. Because Rome debased its currency to pay its legions, and the denarius died and the empire fell. Spain flooded the world with silver, and inflation destroyed its wealth and the empire declined. Britain borrowed to fight 2 world wars, and the pound collapsed and the empire dissolved. And now, the United States prints trillions, runs endless deficits, and believes it's different. But it's not different because the pattern doesn't care about American exceptionalism. It doesn't care about military strength or technological advancement. The pattern is economic, and economic laws are as absolute as physical laws because you cannot print wealth, you cannot borrow forever, and you cannot debase your currency without destroying your empire. So 4 empires experienced 4 collapses in 4 identical patterns. And the only question left is timing. How long until stage 6? How long until the world loses confidence in the dollar? How long until the American empire follows Rome, Spain, and Britain into the history books? Because the pattern says we're close. The debt says we're close. The money printing says we're close. And history, which has watched this exact sequence destroy 4 empires before, says the ending is inevitable. The only variable is how fast it happens and how painful it becomes. So, if this gave you a new perspective, subscribe, because when the pattern completes, you'll want to understand what happened and why, because history has the answers and the pattern never lies.